Le damos la bienvenida a nuestro invitado especial, Steve Coll.
Invitado especial, Steve Coll. Steve Coll, decano de la Escuela de Periodismo de la Universidad de Columbia desde 2013, es redactor de planta en The New Yorker. Es autor de libros de no ficción y ha sido ganador del premio Pulitzer en 2 ocasiones. Entre 1985 y 2005 fue reportero, corresponsal extranjero y editor senior del Washington Post. Allí cubrió Wall Street. Fue el primer corresponsal del periódico en el sur de Asia y fue el primer corresponsal investigativo internacional del Post con sede en Londres. Trabajó como director editorial del Post entre 1998 y 2004. El año siguiente entró a The New Yorker, donde sigue escribiendo sobre política internacional, política americana y seguridad nacional, controversias de inteligencia y medios. Es autor de 8 libros, incluyendo Ghost War, el libro ganador del premio Pulitzer, The Bin Ladens, An Arabian Family in the American Century. Su libro, Private Empire, ExxonMobil and American Power, ganó el premio Financial Times Goldman Sachs de Mejor Libro de Negocios del 2012. Su libro más reciente, Directorate S, se publicará en febrero de 2018. Estando en el Post, Coll ganó otro premio Pulitzer por su reportaje sobre la Comisión de Bolsa y Valores de Estados Unidos, comúnmente conocida como la SEC. Coll también fue presidente de la New America Foundation, un instituto de política pública en Washington, D.C., entre 2007 y 2012.
Good evening. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to be with you. I apologize for not having good enough Spanish to speak to you directly, but I hope the translation will work out. It's a little strange watching a movie about yourself, but I'll try to turn to the occasion. It really is an honor to join you at a celebration of excellence in professional journalism. I do think from my experience at Columbia that prizes like this one, they are a kind of leadership in journalism. They hold up great work to inspire other journalists to reach higher in their own practice. And at public occasions like this one, we have the opportunity to reaffirm democratic society's commitment to a free and independent press. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak briefly about these values, and I want to touch on some of the threats facing journalism globally and how our defense of journalism is tied to the defense of other democratic and constitutional and human rights. So we're all aware of the wave of populism and illiberalism that has swept across the world during the last several years, from the drug war in the Philippines to the rise of sometimes violent Hindu chauvinism in India, to the revival of extreme right-wing political parties in Europe, to the mainstreaming of white nationalism in American politics, culminating in the election of President Trump. This storm is likely to be with us for a while. In the United States, the populist wave, with its loud denunciations of the legitimacy of journalism, with its use of the presidential pulpit to call out direct incitements against the press, has presented new and difficult questions for editors and TV news producers. We spend a lot of time talking about it. How serious are the threats we face? How can the press defend itself without falling into the trap of becoming openly politicized? Are the practices and the conventions of traditional journalism, are they up to the task of covering populists, nativists, white supremacists? The press has never been especially popular, certainly not in the United States. So how do we now, in this polarized atmosphere, best persuade the public, business leaders, government servants, judges, other sectors of society to join journalists in a defense of the role of the press? You know, among the leaders of American newsrooms that I speak with, there are actually divided views about how seriously to take the threat to press freedom. Some editors argue that the best strategy is just to practice great journalism and ignore all the Twitter storms. As Marty Barron, the editor of the Washington Post, puts it, we're not at war, we're at work. And indeed, the Washington Post and many other newsrooms, For them, the recent attacks on the press has served to strengthen them and to strengthen the press. After some years of drift and confusion about where journalism was headed because of the digital revolution and the mobile revolution, the attacks by the president and his allies have helpfully clarified for many people why journalism matters, why it's constitutionally protected in the United States by the First Amendment, and why press freedom is enshrined in many other democratic constitutions around the world. Fortunately, it's not within any president's power to change the Constitution or to rewrite the 46 different state laws we have in the United States that protect or grant privileges to journalists before courts, for example. And at our Supreme Court, commitment to the First Amendment offers a rare area of agreement between justices appointed by both Democratic and Republican presidents. Yet I think there can be no doubt that we are entering a dangerous new era for journalism, both in the United States and globally. I think some of the previous speakers have touched on some of the causes. The threat has three faces. First, when powerful leaders denounce journalism's legitimacy, they invite extremists and criminals to attack reporters physically. Second, in both authoritarian and democratic countries, we're seeing new and aggressive attempts to criminalize some kinds of journalism as a threat to national security. There are more journalists in jail in Turkey today than would fill up this theater, I imagine. Third, we face the confusing problem of fake news, and I don't mean the kind of fake news that President Trump speaks about where he's merely attacking professional journalism that he doesn't like. I mean the truly fake, invented, manufactured, false, and deceptive stories that today pollute social media, such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. This fake news crisis did not arise from journalism itself. It is a product of the opportunism of dark forces that are taking advantage of social media platforms. And this has been abetted by the passivity and the irresponsibility of the large, highly profitable technology corporations that now dominate publishing and advertising. Indeed, the pollution of social media with false and deliberately deceptive news, propaganda, sometimes in alignment with extremist ideological campaigns, is probably the most serious threat of all that journalism faces today. Let me say just a little more about each of the three threats that I've named. Statistically, violent attacks on journalists have fluctuated at a high level for more than 2 decades, and the main reason is impunity. Killers of journalists are much too rarely brought to justice. And so each month, it seems, comes another shock. On September 5, in the prosperous tech hub of Bangalore, India, Gauri Lankesh, a secular writer, was shot down at her doorstep by Hindu extremist assassins. On October 16, in very quiet Malta, Daphne Galizia, an investigative reporter writing about corruption in her government, was murdered in a car bombing attack. In the United States, we haven't gotten there yet, but in the last election, we saw a candidate for Congress tackle a journalist, throw him to the floor, and then win election easily in the aftermath. And this year, we've seen a spike of assaults and arrests of journalists at public protests. So we cannot accept this climate as the new normal. But unless prosecutors and judges treat these crimes seriously and bring perpetrators to justice, the attacks will continue. It has become even harder to defend the rights and democratic role of professional journalists at this time when fake news on Facebook and other platforms is sowing so much confusion. We know from history that revolutions often pass from optimistic beginnings toward dark destinations. From the beginning, the World Wide Web was a polluted place. Pornography, fraud, bullying, even in the very early years of the digital revolution. But now we're witnessing a darker phase still. When the World Wide Web went mainstream 2 decades ago, Silicon Valley utopians told us that our politics and society would markedly change for the better. The web would empower citizens. It would mobilize the wisdom of crowds. This is typical of what happens when revolutionary new technologies arrive in media and journalism. When radio was born, utopians declared it would improve human communities. In some ways it did, but it also empowered Nazism. When television was born, media theorists declared that citizens and voters would be better educated and better informed than ever. The best of television does unify and educate society, but it also trivializes and debases our politics. Now, once again, we are disillusioned by a promised technological utopia, this time social media. And the problem, of course, is not the technology. The problem is the persistence of evil in the world and the permanent nature of the struggle for human dignity, equality, and democratic rights. The dark side of the digital revolution and its impact on journalism is different in each country today, depending on the power of newspapers and television, the role of public media, and the degree of economic advancement. Yet there are some common themes emerging across the world, especially in the democratic world. First, because of the new monopoly power of Facebook and Google, publishers and broadcasters are losing control over the distribution of journalism. I worked for 20 years at the Washington Post. Every night, 5 floors below our newsroom, the presses roared to life. When we made our own newspapers, we put them on our own trucks, we drove them to our customers' driveways, we threw them onto the doorsteps of their homes. We controlled every part of our relationship with our reader. We were accountable to them for our performance, for the quality of our news, for how often we threw the newspapers into the bushes instead of onto the doorstep. Today, the Washington Post is forging a successful digital strategy, but most other newspapers are struggling because they no longer can deliver their own news profitably. They must ask Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Snapchat to handle the advertising and distribution for them, all on highly unfavorable economic terms. The second problem is that these monopoly social platforms, as they've developed their profitable business strategies, have persuaded themselves that they are not media companies, not editors, not broadcasters making ethical and professional judgments about content. Rather, they see themselves as neutral platforms of exchange, open and on equal terms to all, and the companies see themselves as not responsible, by and large, for what is published. The reality, of course, is that Facebook and YouTube and the rest do exercise editorial control, even journalistic judgment, but they do it through software and algorithms that they keep secret. We see now that Facebook's poorly monitored platform, which depends on users to make complaints about hateful or deceptive or offensive content, allowed manipulators such as extremist ideologues, mischievous states such as Russia, and random groups of greedy hackers to pollute news and public discourse, including during our last election campaign. It is shocking to many of us in the United States that even now, a full year after the last presidential election, even Facebook's own executives appear not to understand how far-reaching the spread of false and deceptive news on its platform was during 2016. It took independent researchers and government investigators to crack this thing open, and they're only beginning to discover the scope of what took place, how invented fantasy stories with headlines like "The Pope endorses Donald Trump" spread to tens and tens of millions of users. It's difficult to solve a crisis if you do not even understand its dimensions. And it is more difficult still when the powerful global corporations at the center of the crisis refuse to come to grips with its dimensions. Every computer scientist I've talked to about the problem of fake news on social media tells me that it will get worse over the next few years as artificial intelligence empowers these bad actors. It would be much harder to tell fake news from real news, even in comparison to today. Perhaps the only hope is forceful antitrust action or regulation, but this is unlikely to come from Washington in the current climate. It may eventually come from Europe. So here we are tonight, honoring news of a very different kind: authentic journalism, true news, journalism of the highest caliber, independent, courageous, probing, reported, written by professionals, in the hope that it will serve an educated citizenry. But in this atmosphere, I think it's not enough just to celebrate. We also have to think about the values we share, the ideals of democratic constitutions in the Americas, how they're linked together, and how to persuade our businesses, our citizens, our governments to defend journalism, not just to celebrate the best of it. It's so much noise, and in the face of this global populist wave, how do we defend and advance the kind of journalism we're going to honor in a few minutes? So in closing, I just want to mention 3 ideas that I've been thinking about trying to change the way we argue for journalism. First, I think we can find new language to talk about journalism in constitutional democracies. At least in the United States, too often we journalists argue in defense of our rights, our privileges, or we complain about our struggles to find new economic models. Yet the ideal of press freedom is not rooted in some political theory about the rights or economic entitlements of journalists or publishers. We protect press freedom because when journalism plays its part, the benefits flow to all citizens. When powerful institutions and individuals are held accountable before the voting public, when they are forced into transparency, when corruption is exposed, when the lies of demagogues are fact-checked, when the failure of government to deliver on its promises is investigated and chronicled, everybody benefits. So the defense of journalism is best expressed not as the defense of inalienable rights for our profession, but as the instrument that it is of a much larger aspiration among middle classes everywhere for clean government, accountability, inclusion, diverse participation, and progress. We should also point out that when the rights of journalists and publishers are repressed, whether it's in Turkey or Egypt or the United States, it is always the case historically that other human and civil rights of minorities, of marginalized groups, of unpopular opinions are also repressed. We do not have to look that deeply into history to be reminded that the struggle for equality and to enshrine rights protecting human dignity and agency is not like an a la carte menu where you can pick some rights to favor and leave others aside. In particular, without a free press, the suppression of other rights, of the political opposition of unpopular minority groups will proceed with impunity and in darkness. Finally, I think in journalism we have to pull out of our despair about the economic challenges our profession faces and start to take back our own independence. Newspapers may survive for many years, but the era of journalism dominated by independent newspapers in the United States is over. We have yet to craft a durable economic basis for a new era of journalistic independence, free from government control and sustainable, whether commercially or through philanthropy. There are promising new models emerging, and there will be fierce competition over who makes and delivers the news to the young generations who are becoming adults now, beginning to reshape our politics. But to rebuild journalism for the next generation, to insist on excellence and transparency and professionalism, it's an urgent project and it requires a sense of activism. If we lament the loss of the past, we may be disappointed by the future. Journalism has produced some of the great characters and minds of our overlapping cultures, from Mark Twain to Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Journalists are fun to be around, even though we're being kind of somber right now. There will be more partying to come tonight. There are people with in my experience, people with a fierce, restless independence, a willingness to call things as they are. I had the privilege to know Ben Bradley, the legendary editor of the Washington Post, when I was a new reporter there. He transferred me to cover Wall Street for the paper, and I went in to meet him before I went to New York to hear his instructions. He said, "My father lost everything in the stock market crash of 1929. They're all a bunch of crooks. Go up there and cover the place like a crime scene." I walked out of his office with a spring in my step, and I still have it 3 decades later. When journalism is vigorous, unruly, a little dangerous, we're all better off. Congratulations to tonight's honorees, to the enterprise and independence reflected in your work. We need it. We need to renew our work to defend it. Thank you.